one of the things that I and many of my colleagues learned in these countries over the last 25, 30 years is that a lot of conflict remains intractable. A lot of peace agreements remain fragile. And the question is, what are we missing about the human experience? What are we missing about, what humans experience and their fears and their anxieties that make real reconciliation or the resolution of really longstanding conflict difficult? And so that's what led me to brain and behavioral science, because the very sort of foundation of our approach was human experience. It wasn't, 7 steps to yes or something else. It was like constantly looking for those human examples of people that have struggled through change and we felt in others that they had something to offer. And I told Artemis that about 12 years ago, I was teaching a class at the Fletcher School at Tufts, and it was called Conflict Transformation in the 21st Century, the Human Dimension, because I felt a lot of conflict resolution theory was really paper thin or missing the human component in a really sort of practical yet, I think, profound way. And every other class I'd have a speaker come in. And so one class I had Jerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland, if you remember, was the Sinn Féin, he'll never admit it, but also an IRA leader. And a student sat across from him and asked the question, so how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have tried to kill you, or people may have been killed on both sides? And he sat back and thought, in this sort of very thick North Belfast accent, which I won't try, he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room who was probably in his mid-70s at the time. It was about 12 years ago. And he had been sitting in these classes. And he came up to me and he said, there's a lot of brain science behind these themes of humiliation or empathy or fear that different speakers have brought up. I mean, one speaker was Jose Ramos Horta, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in East Timor, or, Zahira Kamal from Palestine. And they weren't, primed to discuss this, but not surprisingly, issues of fear, humiliation, exclusion, empathy would come up. And he finally came up and he said, there's a lot of brain science. And I said, what do you mean brain science? I said, I understand some of the social psychology literature or what I've experienced or what I've observed. And he said something so powerful. He said, he said, speaking as a scientist, we're not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities are understood and valued by others. As we see ourselves, that's how we really begin to think rationally, when we feel that our identities are understood and valued. And at that moment, I had sort of that aha, because it collapsed so much of what I've observed and so much of my experience around the world and in my own upbringing, that one of the benefits where I'm based in Boston is be able to go to these brilliant young scientists at local universities. And I had a big sort of aha moment to realize, that, the Enlightenment got a lot of this stuff wrong, right? We are not rational beings where emotions get in the way. I mean, at MIT, where we have this really powerful partnership over the last decade, you'd have in the political science and social sciences department, people being minted with PhDs that humans are fundamentally rational actors, reason-based beings, and don't even think of cognition and emotion. And meanwhile, you have the departments of cognitive and neuro and other sciences where it's just the opposite, that they're minting PhDs in, right? That we are mammals, that close to 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. Focus on how we think, not what we think, because how we think is so deeply unconscious. In fact, over at Northeastern, a brilliant scientist, Lisa Barrett Feldman, who's written a great book about emotion, talks about how our brains evolved to be predictive. And she and many other researchers do that. And it's constantly navigating the world, asking the question, what do others think about me and us? And so the more I got into this, the more I sat back in a quite humbled way and realized that one of the reasons we're dealing with, at least in the work I was doing internationally, so much profound difficulty is because we're burdened with a view of the world, that humans are fundamentally rational beings and emotions keep on getting in our way, when in fact, it's really the opposite. And if we really want to understand the biggest challenges we face, we need to understand how cognition and emotion work in the brain. And one of the great breakthroughs 3 years ago a friend of mine who's one of the deans at MIT and used to run the political science department, after a conference on norms, narratives, and neurons. And this was 7 years ago, before the Trump election, sort of highlighted the word norm or norms again. That she said that in political science, she says, we make so many assumptions about what shapes human behavior that we miss two of the most important, cognition and emotion. And I sat back and thought, well, on one level, that's a breakthrough. On another level, what else is there? We either think or we feel. And so, we then started really engaging with, at major universities and elsewhere, brain and behavioral scientists, and bring that knowledge and also generate new knowledge to real world challenges around social conflict and social change. And one of the things we did recently, which is how Artemis and I reconnected, is working with colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania. We started looking after the 2016 election at deepening polarization in the United States. And we, working with some brain and behavioral scientists there, wanted to understand how polarization is impacting the psychology of Americans. And so over a year and a half, with a series of national surveys, our scientists looked at the role of misperception or meta misperception on a national scale. And Artemis, maybe later you can share the report. It's called America's Divided Mind. And what we did was, our colleagues at UPenn is looked at Democrats and Republicans, because I think everybody here knows we're not a multi-party democracy. And so for decades, fault lines have been emerging in the United States that have been aggregating principally in those two identities. And so what we started looking at through a series of questions about big contentious issues, but also about feelings and also about dehumanization, I'll maybe mention this briefly, we found, to no one's surprise, that polarization is deepening and it's becoming identity-based. And we would ask, for example, in this research, we would ask representative Democrats and Republicans. So for example, to a Democrat, we'd ask the question, so where are you as a Democrat, and where do you think other Democrats are on the issue of open borders and immigration? And what we'd find, not surprising, is some strong positions, very different than the Republican side. But there were a lot of Democrats that sort of crossed into the middle. And then when you'd ask a Republican the same, you'd have strong positions, but a lot of Republicans crossed into the middle. But if you'd ask a Democrat, where do you think the Republicans are on the issue of open borders and immigration? The majority response is they want them completely closed. When you'd ask a Republican, where do you think the Democrats are? The majority response is they want them completely open. And so on a series of big contentious issues, from gun control to immigration to abortion, Democrats and Republicans misperceived by nearly 50% the position of the other side. And then on issues of like and dislike, which is, how much do you like the other side? And then the question is, how much do you think they dislike you? It's up near 50%. And then our researchers did some really novel research on dehumanization. So we have a separate initiative called Decoding Dehumanization, because there are a lot of words out there that we use. And I, as a non-scientist, started saying, wait a minute, let's unpack this scientifically. So when we talk about empathy, what does empathy actually mean as a psychological process in the brain? When we talk about humiliation, what is that actually in the brain? When we talk about dehumanization, why do we dehumanize people? How does that actually work in the brain? And we've done, by the way, on our website, there's a report on decoding dehumanization that's really, I think, I say with all due modesty, quite interesting, because it breaks down, like, for example, we process disgust and fear differently in our brain than each other. And knowing that is really important, because how you respond to it is really critical. But on this issue, our researchers for the last 8 years in 13 countries around the world looked at blatant dehumanization. It's a very blunt instrument, but if you know the ascent of man scale that shows early primates all the way up to humans, it's a blunt instrument, but it's a very powerful telling instrument. Well, on a scale of 0 to 100, we would ask people, where would you place the groups on this evolution of man scale? Which means, how fully human are they? And we started doing this, as Kim will know, in Europe around the Roma, trying to understand the dehumanization of the Roma. And even finding that in many countries, not surprisingly, the Roma were some of the most dehumanized people. So we brought that here to the United States in this research. And we would ask Democrats and Republicans, where would you place your own tribe, so to speak, fellow Democrats and Republicans? And it's interesting, around the world, nobody puts their own group or community at fully 100%. Because we know our own communities, right? Like, that person isn't fully with it, right? So in the United States, Democrats and Republicans place their own groups at around the high eights. I mean, like 89, 88, 90. But when you'd ask a Democrat to place a Republican to place a Democrat, it was around 82, 81, 83. So not fully human, but not really bad. But when we'd ask a Democrat and a Republican, how much do you think the other side dehumanizes you? It's up near 50%. Like and dislike and on issues. So we sat back and thought, wait a minute. So polarization is becoming identity-based. It's becoming sectarian in the United States. And one thing we know from science is that when we develop an us versus them tribal mindset, a whole range of unconscious psychological processes kick in to then operate under the hood and drive us further apart. It's like just putting fuel on a fire. And we can see that playing out today. But then a lot of that is because we don't know each other. We're getting information in separate silos from separate media, social media, churches, communities, where we live. We don't know each other. And yet, that is driving a big chunk. And also leaders. It's no surprise when you have a leader like the president and others, they have a huge normative influence on people. But people, when you ask them about really core issues and issues like and dislike and dehumanization, they overestimate by 50% how much the other side dislikes them. And so the good news is that we can correct that. And we have colleagues at Harvard and other universities who, with people, literally just telling them that this is a misperception creates a cognitive shift in people's brains. Think of it in our own personal lives. If you think somebody hates you and your family or a neighbor, and then you find out actually they don't, it calms you down. Increases trust and warmth. And that's a really important finding. So that's part of what we're doing is we're testing, various quote unquote interventions through different media and working with different communities and even the media to get this information out there. And like Ezra Klein, Artemis, I didn't think to send it to you, from David Brooks to Ezra Klein and many other people have really written about this because, it's both, here's the difficult thing we need to understand about deepening polarization, but also here's the reality and here's the good news and here's what we need to act on to address this. And so I just want to give you a little bit of that background. And, one thing I'll mention, I think of myself as a longstanding progressive, but, we've been doing research. We have a colleague, we've been funding some research over at Harvard, and they're trying to reduce polarization. And they've developed now for a year and a half these games where people are playing games in traditional gaming, where they partner up in cooperation, where there's a liberal and a conservative. And they did some research, and if you know the TV show Duck Dynasty, I don't know if anybody on here watches it, but Duck Dynasty is a reality TV show. And then there's a show, Stranger Things. Well, it turns out more conservatives know Duck Dynasty and more liberals know Stranger Things. So you have a liberal and conservative knowing they're both liberals and conservative playing with each other. And when asked, to the two of them, can we name the cast? The conservatives often say, I can name that. And they both sort of win. And then the liberal says, I can do Stranger Things. And literally, you can see it as we follow it, they're sort of high-fiving each other. But here's the thing. 4 months later, playing a 1-hour game, warmth and division decreases, but it lasts longer with conservatives than it does with liberals. And the hypothesis is that many conservatives are non-college educated, or even if they are, when they come to that game, they come with all these sort of heuristics and expectations that they're going to be looked down upon, they're going to be shamed, they're going to be stigmatized, they're not so sophisticated. they're going to be held in contempt. And when they're not, their warmth towards liberals actually lasts much longer than liberals to conservatives. And we have seen this consistently in other at University of Pennsylvania, at Harvard and others. Is, I think, a really important insight we're going to test further is that one of the divides in this country is the view that we're looked down upon. And particularly on, I don't want to say just on the right, but people who are non-college educated or live in certain parts of the country or have certain sort of demographic backgrounds. And that's what a Donald Trump and other leaders tap into, a sense of grievance, a sense of people looking down upon you, a sense of people hold you in contempt. And nobody wants to be treated that way. And when you can correct those, it actually has a huge cognitive emotional impact on people in a positive way. So maybe, Artemis, I don't want to spend too much time on this research, but I wanted to mention a bit of that. And the other thing is we've been doing work on empathy and really trying to bring this into the United States at this moment. And, you know, many leaders I've worked with around the world, from leaders of the African National Congress in South Africa to, you know, other sort of, you know, liberation movements or and other countries, are deeply concerned, not surprisingly, what's happening in the United States, but not on just one side.
Right.
You know, they see it across both sides. They're like, the US can't make the mistakes we made. You know, be tough on structures and institutions, but not on each other. And that's one of the most important lessons that Mandela and many other people said, is be tough on structures and institutions, but not on each other, because then what is it you have to build upon? So maybe, Artemis, I'll finish with that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.